The dinner table was set perfectly, as always. White linen, crystal glasses, candles that my mother had spent 40 minutes arranging. My family doesn't do casual, even on a Tuesday. There were 8 of us that night. My parents, my sister Camille, her husband, 2 of my parents' business associates, and their wives, and me. I had just closed the biggest independent deal of my career 3 days earlier. A commercial real estate acquisition worth just over $4 million. My name, my financing, my years of work. I hadn't told them yet. I was waiting for the right moment. My mother raised her glass during the salad course. "We should all take a moment," she said, smiling in Camille's direction, "to recognize someone who continues to make this family proud." Everyone turned. Camille lowered her eyes the way she always does. The practiced humility, the graceful deflection. The Hargrove Group just named her one of the top 40 under 40 in commercial development, my mother continued. The table applauded. My father beamed. Camille's husband squeezed her hand. I clapped too. One of my parents' associates leaned toward me with a kind smile. "And what is it you do again, sweetheart?" Before I could answer, Camille cut in. "Mara is still finding her footing," she said warmly. The table nodded. Sympathetic. Moving on. I smiled and picked up my fork. Then I felt my phone vibrate in my lap. I glanced down. It was the wire confirmation I'd been waiting for. The final transfer. The deal was sealed and recorded. I set my phone face down. "You're right," I said softly, looking at my mother. She didn't notice the sentence. No one did, but I did. Let me explain how we got here. My name is Mara. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in a house with 4 bathrooms. A housekeeper named Rosa, who had worked for my family since before I was born, and parents who believed, sincerely and completely, that appearances were a form of currency. My father built his wealth in commercial real estate, mid-sized properties, strategic acquisitions, nothing flashy, just patient. Disciplined accumulation over 30 years. My mother was the architect of the family's image. She chose the neighborhoods, the schools, the charities we donated to, the church we attended, the Christmas cards. She was not a cruel woman. I want to be clear about that. She was just selective. Camille came first. She was born 18 months before me, and by the time I arrived, the family's emotional architecture was already established. Camille was magnetic. Even as a child, she knew how to read a room, say the right thing, laugh at exactly the right moment. She was the one who made adults feel smart and seen. She went to Wharton, graduated with honors, joined a development firm at 23 and climbed quickly. And she was in many ways genuinely talented. That part is important to say. This isn't a story about a fraud. Camille was real. Her success was real. Her intelligence was real. The problem wasn't that she was good. The problem was that she needed to be the only one. I was quieter. I took a different path. I spent my 20s working under 2 separate real estate firms, learning the industry from the operational side instead of the executive track. I studied financing structures, zoning law, development cycles. I got licensed. I got certified. I built slowly. My parents acknowledged my work the way you acknowledge the weather. Noted. Not particularly interesting. Mara's more of a behind-the-scenes person, my mother used to say. She meant it as a compliment. I don't think she ever realized it wasn't one. It started with the Dalton Street project. I had spent 8 months putting together a mixed-use development proposal in a transitional neighborhood just east of downtown. I had a silent investor, an architect, and preliminary conversations with 2 anchor tenants. I also had a meeting scheduled with a private equity group called Caldwell Partners. The meeting was set for Thursday morning in March. On Wednesday evening, I got a call from their assistant. They were passing. No explanation beyond, the project no longer fits our current portfolio direction. I was disappointed, but these things happen. I spent the next 2 months restructuring the proposal and found alternate financing. Then that fell through too. Different firm, different reason, but the same week, the same strange, vague language. We've received some concerns about the underlying projections. I asked what concerns. They couldn't elaborate. I rebuilt again. Third attempt, different investor. This time, a family friend of my father's, a man named Gerald, who had invested in several of my father's early properties. He called me personally. "Mara," he said gently, "I've known your family a long time. I think you're capable, but I'm hearing that your financial modeling has some structural issues. I'd feel better waiting until you've addressed those." I stared at my laptop. My financial modeling was the thing I was most confident in. I asked him where he'd heard that. He hesitated. "It came up in conversation," he said. "I don't want to involve anyone, but you might want to take another look." I thanked him, hung up, and sat very still for a long time. Then I started thinking. The first time, I assumed bad timing. The second time, I assumed a slow market. But 3 times, with the same category of doubt about my competence, my models, my foundation, from people who all existed in overlapping social circles, that was not a coincidence. That was a pattern, and I'd been trained my whole life to ignore patterns that implicated Camille. Not anymore. Around the same time, I noticed other things shifting. My fiancé at the time, his name was Daniel, started asking different questions. Small questions, at first. Things that could have been innocent curiosity. "Did your deal fall through again? Your sister mentioned you've been stressed lately. Is everything okay with your finances? Just, I want to make sure we're on solid footing before the wedding." I looked at him carefully. "When did you talk to Camille?" "She called to congratulate us on the engagement," he said. "We just talked for a while." Daniel and Camille had no reason to talk regularly. They were cordial, nothing more. I let it go in the moment, but I filed it. Then at my parents' anniversary dinner, my father pulled me aside. He was gentle about it. He always is when he's delivering doubt. "Mara," he said, putting his hand on my shoulder, "your mother and I have been talking. We're a little concerned. Camille mentioned you've had some setbacks, and we just want to make sure you're not overextending yourself." I asked him, "What setbacks?" He looked slightly confused, like he was recalling something secondhand. "She said there were some concerns about your capital structure, that you might be in over your head." I hadn't told Camille anything about my capital structure. Not one word. I told my father everything was fine, that I appreciated his concern. He nodded, patted my arm, and went back to his guests. And I went to the bathroom, sat on the edge of the tub, and opened the Notes app on my phone. I started a list. Every conversation, every deal that fell through, every name that came up, every phrase that felt borrowed, like it had come from somewhere else before it reached me. I wrote it all down. Date. Detail. Source. I'd been doing this for 6 weeks by the time I found the email. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds. It sounds like suspicion becoming paranoia. It sounds like a woman who failed and needed someone to blame. I was aware of that possibility. I sat with it honestly, but I am also someone who was trained by a meticulous father to follow evidence rather than emotion, to look at what the numbers actually say, and the numbers were saying something. It was my accountant who first found the thread. His name is Bernard. He's been my accountant since I started my first LLC. Careful, precise, old school. He called me one afternoon and said, very quietly, "Mara, I need you to come in." I sat across from his desk. He slid a printed email chain toward me. It had been forwarded twice from a private address I didn't recognize to Caldwell Partners. The email contained a version of my Dalton Street projections, but they had been altered. Not dramatically, subtly. The kind of changes that would take a trained eye to catch a rounding error here, a shifted depreciation schedule there, an omission in the cash flow assumptions that made the long-term return look unstable. The original file had been sent to 3 people: my architect, my attorney, and Camille. I had sent it to Camille 6 months earlier. She'd offered to look it over. Fresh eyes, she said. I trusted her. Bernard cleared his throat softly. There's more, he said. He slid another page across. It was a financial reference letter, typed on professional letterhead, from an anonymous source, but the language was specific enough to trace. It had been sent to Gerald, my father's investor friend. The letter described concerns about my pattern of overextension and my history of underfunded projects. I had one previous project. One. And it had turned a modest profit. I looked at Bernard. How did you find these? Gerald's assistant, he said. She used to work for your father's firm. She felt uncomfortable about it. She reached out to me directly. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't cry. I was past crying. I thought about Camille sitting across from me at our parents' table, raising her glass, accepting praise, and smiling at me with exactly the right amount of warmth. And I thought, she's been doing this for years. Not just to me. She'd been managing her position, her inheritance, her access to our father's business contacts, his reputation, his trust. I was not the only threat she'd neutralized. I was just the closest one. I thanked Bernard. I drove home. I did not call Camille. I did not call my parents. I did not post anything, say anything, or hint at anything. Steady breath. I went home and I started building something she wouldn't see coming. Here is what I knew. Camille was not sloppy. She was surgical. She operated through implication and suggestion, never direct statement. She left no obvious fingerprints. Confronting her with what I had would give her time to reframe it, to make me look unhinged, to go to my parents first with some preemptive story about how worried she'd been about Mara. So I did not confront her. I smiled at Sunday dinners. I asked about her projects. I let her believe I had given up on the Dalton Street development. I hadn't. I had restructured it entirely. Under a new LLC, one Camille had no connection to, no visibility into. I used a different attorney and a different financial model, built from scratch, reviewed by Bernard alone. I spent 3 months requalifying the project under a commercial development fund that operated outside my family's social network entirely. They said yes in 47 days. But that was only part of what I was building. The other part was the documentation. I spent those same 3 months compiling a timeline, not for revenge, for protection. Every altered document, every suspicious conversation, every instance where language from a private conversation appeared word for word in a third party's concern. Bernard had identified 3 separate instances where deal-relevant information had been leaked. All 3 traced back to documents Camille had seen. It hurt. I want to say that plainly. It wasn't the business damage that hurt most. It was the arithmetic of it counting the years and realizing how long this had probably been happening. It hurt. Not because I needed their approval, but because I needed honesty. I also had a quiet conversation with Daniel. Not a confrontation. A conversation. I showed him the timeline. Not everything, just enough. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She told me you'd been struggling emotionally, that you were sensitive about the business because you felt overshadowed." I watched his face as he heard himself say it, watched him realize what had been happening. He looked at me. "Mara, I'm sorry. I didn't." "I know," I said, and I did. He wasn't a villain. He was just someone she'd managed. Like everyone else, I filed the Dalton Street deal. I finalized the new acquisition, a separate property I'd been quietly developing for 16 months. under the new LLC. And then I waited, because Camille always makes a final move. That was her pattern. When she thought she'd won, she would do one last thing. Something public, something polished, something that looked generous. I only had to wait 4 weeks. My parents' 40th anniversary gala. It was held at a venue my mother had been planning for 8 months. 97 guests, a live quartet, speeches, a custom photo display, donations to a family foundation in my parents' name. Camille had organized most of it. Of course she had. I wore a dark green dress. I arrived on time. I helped Rosa with the centerpieces. I kissed my mother's cheek and told her she looked beautiful, because she did, and I waited. The evening moved through its rhythm. Dinner, toasts. The photo display, more toasts. Then Camille stood up. She was radiant, as always. She tapped her glass. I wanted to take a moment. She said, "To honor not just my parents, but what they've built. This family's legacy is something I've worked to carry forward with everything I have." The room was warm with agreement. My mother had tears in her eyes. Then Camille smiled, the specific smile she uses when she's about to do something that looks generous and isn't, and said, "I also want to announce that I've formally proposed to the board that the Hargrove Family Trust transition its primary development account to a consolidated structure, which I'll be managing going forward." She looked at my father. "Dad, I think it's time. The family's assets should be unified, protected." My father looked moved. What Camille was proposing in beautifully curated language, in front of 97 witnesses, was centralized control of the family trust under her, which would have effectively removed me from any meaningful inheritance position. It would have been the final move. My father started to nod, and that was when I stood up. "I think that's a wonderful instinct," I said. Everyone looked at me. Camille's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. "Actually," I said, "I've been speaking with the family's estate attorney about something similar. Bernard, would you like to share what we filed last week?" Bernard, who was seated 2 tables away, opened the folder he had been holding all evening. 3 weeks ago," I said, calmly, "I registered a formal request with Hargrove Family Trust's Administrative Board to commission an independent audit of all discretionary trust communications over the past 5 years. The room was quiet. "The audit has been approved. It begins next month." I watched Camille's jaw. She didn't move. "Additionally," I said, "I want to share something with this family, because I think transparency is something we all value." I nodded to Bernard, who passed a small bound document to the 3 people closest to my parents. "This is a summary of a pattern that Bernard and I identified over the past year. It documents 3 instances in which proprietary business documents shared only within a limited circle were altered and forwarded to third parties in ways that resulted in the collapse of my development financing. Each document was shared with one consistent recipient. I didn't say Camille's name. I didn't need to. My father looked at the document, then at Camille, then back at the document. My mother's hand had stopped moving on her glass. "I don't raise this to cause harm," I said. "I raise it because this family has always said it values honesty, and I think we should mean that, even when it's difficult." Camille spoke. Her voice was perfectly controlled, gracious even. "Mara," she said, "I think you've been under a lot of pressure, and I want you to know that I have only ever wanted." "I know what you wanted," I said, not coldly, just precisely. "And I want you to know the Dalton Street project closed last Tuesday. $4.3 million, clean financing, independent LLC." I looked at my father. "I also want you to know that I don't need the trust restructured. I built something of my own. I just needed this family to know the truth about why it almost didn't happen." Long silence. The quartet had stopped playing. No one spoke for a long moment. Then My father set down his glass, very slowly, and he said, "Camille, I need to see those documents." That was all. That was enough. The gala ended early. Guests found their coats. The quartet packed up. My mother stood near the door saying quiet goodbyes with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Camille sat at the head table for a long time after most people had gone. I watched her from across the room. Not with satisfaction. Not exactly. With something more complicated than that. In the weeks that followed, the audit process began. Camille hired her own attorney almost immediately, which told my father everything he needed to know about the scale of what had been managed. She tried several approaches. The first was denial. She said the email chain was misrepresented, that she'd simply shared my projections with someone she thought might help me. My father, to his credit, asked why she hadn't mentioned that. She didn't have a clean answer. The second approach was deflection. She suggested that I was bitter about the family's perception of me, that this was a projection of my own insecurities. My mother looked at her when she said that, then looked away. That was its own kind of answer. The third approach was the one that almost worked. She came to my parents' house on a Sunday morning, just the three of them, no attorneys. She cried, and she said something that was probably the most honest thing she'd said in years. I was afraid. I was afraid that if Mara succeeded on her own, you'd realize you never needed to choose. My mother told me about that conversation 3 weeks later. She was quiet when she recounted it, the way you are when something has rearranged itself inside you. "I didn't know we'd made you feel that way," she told me. "Either of you." I put my hand over hers. I didn't say anything, because the truth is complicated, and I had learned that saying more than necessary doesn't always serve the truth. Daniel and I worked through what happened. It wasn't simple. Trust is not a switch. But he stayed, and he was honest with me about what he'd believed and why. That honesty mattered more to me than any apology. The trust restructuring was tabled entirely. My father brought in an independent advisor to review the family's financial architecture, which was probably overdue, regardless of everything else. Camille retained her role at her firm. Her professional success was not touched by any of this. It wasn't meant to be. I was never trying to destroy her. I was trying to be seen. I think about favoritism differently now than I did growing up. When you're inside it, you absorb it. You interpret it as truth. The favorite child is better, smarter, more worthy, not because of a structural bias, but because they genuinely are, and you simply aren't. That belief is not always loud. Often it's just a slow, internal calibration. The way you learn to take up less space. Expect less. Explain yourself more. What I didn't understand, what took me years to understand, is that favoritism damages everyone it touches. It damaged me, obviously, in the ways I've described, but it also damaged Camille. She spent years building an architecture of control because she had been taught subtly, consistently, without anyone meaning to, that her position was something that could be lost, that she had to earn it continuously, that if someone else rose, she would fall. That's not a comfortable life. That's a siege. And no amount of accolades changes the fact that you're living in one. My parents are not villains. I want to say that again, because it matters. They are people who loved their children imperfectly, who confused admiration with love and public success with worth, who had their own wounds that shaped how they gave their attention. They are also people who, when confronted with the truth, chose to look at it. That is not nothing. That is actually a great deal. I am still in relationship with my family. Not the same relationship. Something new, more honest, more boundaried, more deliberate. Camille and I do not have the closeness we might have had, but we have something. We are working on something. It is slow, and it is real. As for what I built, the Dalton Street project is in its second phase now. 2 anchor tenants signed. The mixed-use structure is performing above projection. The separate acquisition, the one I built in silence while I waited, is generating consistent returns. Not because I'm exceptional, because I'm patient, and because I stopped waiting to be believed and started building something that spoke for itself. There is a specific kind of power that comes from being underestimated. Not because it's comfortable. It isn't. But because it removes the audience when no one is watching, when no one expects anything, when the room has moved on to the person they've decided matters, you can build without interference. And when what you've built is finally visible, it can't be argued with, not by dismissal, not by implication, not by a sister with a warm smile and a forwarded email. The numbers don't lie. And they don't care about birthdays, dinner table seating, or who got the louder applause. Being the favorite only works when no one checks the numbers. I did. And I would do it again. Every quiet step, every documented email, every patient month of building something no one could see yet. Not because I needed to win, but because I needed to be honest about what had happened. And I needed my family to be, too. That was worth more than any trust restructuring, worth more than any deal. It still is. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been the one in the room who everyone underestimated while someone else collected the credit, you are not alone. And you are probably stronger than you know. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Real, grounded, human stories about what it costs to stay quiet, build carefully, and hold your ground. And if you've been here a while, thank you. Your support genuinely means something to me. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done if you were in Mara's position? Would you have confronted Camille the moment you suspected her? Would you have walked away from the family entirely? Or would you have done exactly what she did, documented everything, and waited? There's no wrong answer. I'm genuinely curious. Let me know below. And if you know someone who has ever been the overlooked one, the one who was told they were still finding their footing while they were quietly building something extraordinary, share this with them. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is let them know that patience isn't weakness. It's the long game. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.